Have you ever considered baking bread and looked at a recipe and been totally overwhelmed by how complicated it looks? Today we're going to talk about 10 basic steps to making a loaf of bread. Come on in. I'm not necessarily going over a bread recipe here or even giving you a bread recipe. What I'm talking about today is the 10 steps that are required through the process of creating bread. So it's 10 basic steps to baking bread. 1, you know, any recipe you have to measure. Baking is more of a science than cooking a pot of soup, for example. Soup, you can take your broth and vegetables and throw them together. Baking is more of a science chemical reaction. So you have to be a little more precise. This recipe calls for 9.5 to 10.5 cups of flour. Now that variance is because of the humidity of your location may be different, and you might need more or less to get the density and the texture you want. Step 1, we've measured our ingredients. This recipe calls for 6 tablespoons of sugar. I'm using organic cane sugar. Six tablespoons might sound like a lot, but this is a recipe that makes 3 loaves. And 2 tablespoons of salt. In our house, we're reducing our salt, so I'm not going to use 2 whole tablespoons, but I need to put some salt in there because it does affect the flavor. Step 2 is to bloom the yeast. Some recipes, you will take your milk and your sugar or honey and hot water, and you warm it up, and then you mix your yeast in it, and you wait for a few minutes to have evidence that the yeast is actually active and it's going to start bubbling. The recipe I've chosen today, I made a goof. I should have looked at my recipe a little more closely before I started recording. The recipe I'm using today, you put your yeast right in the flour, and we've already done that. So the blooming process is going to be a combination of the hot liquid and the flour yeast combination. You won't be able to see the evidence of it, but it's still blooming the yeast. That is essentially the heat and the moisture activating the yeast and getting it started. The recipe I've chosen today doesn't actually go through the step of blooming the yeast the way I can show you, so I'll give you an example of one here. I've got some warm water. The temperature of this water it's warm to touch. It's not hot, but it's slightly warmer than your hands. So this is 96 degrees, and yeah, 96 degrees, a little bit, you know, body temperature. I'm going to mix in, the recipe would tell you how much, but you need some sugar or some honey or something for the yeast to feed on. So because this is just a sample, an example, I'm not going to measure it. I'm going to melt that in. And this yeast I'm using is actually expired. So let's give it a test and see if it's going to do its trick. I'm just going to sprinkle that on top of the warm water. In your recipe, you would measure that out so you have an accurate amount. Stir that in gently so it's not floating on top. And now we wait. Can you see how this has got a layer on the top of it now and it's all bubbly? Let's zoom in a little. Let's zoom in a little bit. Can you see how that's all foamy on top now? That yeast is blooming. And now it can go into the recipe if we were using it in this recipe. Next we have the mixing and kneading. Well, you've seen the old-fashioned knead the bread and squish it and pound it and go at it. Today's heavy-duty mixers, you can do that in your machine. But I like to do a little bit of both. I like to mix it in the machine, let it knead for a little bit in the machine, and then get my hands on it, because it's just part of the process that I like. I'll show you how to do both. I've heated my milk, sugar, salt, and butter. As the recipe suggested, it should be between 120 and 130 degrees. And I think this is a little bit on the high side, but there you go, it's 129. And that's ready to go in. I really love having a kitchen thermometer. It is a blessing to me in everyday use. Okay, step 3 is mix and knead. After that's well moistened, I'm going to turn the speed up a little bit. This recipe could entirely be done by hand if you want to spend that much time and labor doing it. If you have a machine to use, then save yourself some time and muscle. And sometimes you have to scrape down the side of the bowl. Make sure that you're mixing all of that stuff from the bottom and the sides into the liquid. At this stage you can see it's coming together. Okay, so there's my dough of ball. There's my dough of ball. There's my ball of dough out of the mixer. And I'm going to just push it and roll it and push it and pull it. And I like mostly to pull it towards me and push it away with my hands. Turn it, pull it towards me, push it away with my hands. I'm pushing downwards. Turn it and push. Pull it, push, pull it, push. So you're bringing a section of it into the middle and pushing it away. And you can do this for 5 minutes or whatever your recipe suggests. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I really like this process. Here's another method. I don't know if this is a tested method or a method that's taught, but I just love to grab the ball and just rock it back and forth. I'm still pushing downwards on it and developing the gluten. That's what kneading is for. Kneading is to develop the gluten inside the bread, the part that makes it stretchy, the part that allows the yeast to make it a soft, fluffy loaf. Can you see how this dough is tearing a little bits while I'm kneading it? I'll show you the difference as we get further along. Add more flour if you need to. Can you see the difference between the tearing surface and the surface that's not tearing? I'm almost getting there. Next, in this process, we have the first rise. See that surface now? There's a few little tears, but that will work itself out. Next is the first rise. You're going to want a bowl and some kind of oil in the bowl. I've chosen olive oil because I don't mind the flavor of olive oil, but you could certainly butter the pan or use shortening or lard or whatever oil you happen to have handy. Roll the dough around so that it's not going to stick to the pan, the bowl, and coat the sides of it. Now we're going to cover that with a damp tea towel to keep it from drying out, or a sheet of plastic wrap, whichever you prefer. I've got a tea towel here. And we're going to set that in a draft-free place until it doubles in size. Check back about 45 minutes, depending on how warm your environment is. And while that's rising, we can clean up. Step 1, measure. Step 2, bloom the yeast. Step 3, mix and knead. Step 4, the first rise. After it's done its first rise, we're going to give it a poke with 2 fingers and see if that holds or not. So step 5 is to shape the bread. We're going to knock it down and we're going to shape it into our loaves or our buns, and we're going to put it in the pans. We're getting there. So it's been about an hour since I put the bread in the bowl to rise, and I wanted it to go for double the volume. Look at the size of that. It's well over the side of the bowl now. Okay, the next step is to do the 2-finger test. If it leaves indentations, then it should be ready to go. Okay, that's just air coming out around the side of the bowl. That's fine. Look at how well that's holding that hole. It's not overproofed. If it was overproofed, it would have collapsed completely. This is good. Okay, we're going to punch this down and cut it into 3 pieces and go forward from there. This is supposed to make 3 loaves. This next step is not necessary, but I kind of like to do it. I weigh out these sections to see how evenly I've divided it. Okay, I've got them just about even. I'm going to punch each of them down and shape them into different things. This one I'm just going to punch down into a rectangle and make as a loaf of bread. Two of them I'm doing that. So we're basically making a rectangle. A triangle will work. Let's not get any snags in there. And just roll it up. Okay, I've turned it upside down so the seam is in my fingers, and I'm just going to roll that back and forth until I can get them to bind together. This is the shaping stage. This one is also going to be a loaf. Making sure there's no air bubbles in there while I'm doing this, so I don't end up with a big pocket of air inside my finished loaf. You know, the jam just runs right through that when you get a hole in the bread. It feels like there might be a hole here. There we go. I'll fix that. Pinch it back together. There was a big air bubble in there, I just poked it. Tuck the ends in a little. And the bottom doesn't have to be pretty. It's going to sit on that for another rise and then for a bake. And this one, I'm going to cut this into 8. I'm going to make hamburger buns or dinner rolls or whatever out of this one. And they're not going to be even. Okay, and now that I'm making buns, I'm just going to stretch it a little and then squeeze the, see if I show you this way. I'm just stretched it a little and then I'm squeezing the bottom in. I'll just roll that over and basically make a ball. I don't know exactly. You know, it's bread. We're going to eat it. It's not going to a fine diner or anything special. It's bread. I'm going to actually push these flat. I've been finding my buns lately have been, my buns, I'm going to push these flat. I've been finding my buns lately are too large. If you knew me, you'd get that joke. My husband doesn't call me bootyful for nothing. No, there is an art to this. An experienced baker knows how to do this well. This is just the basics, right? Once you've done it for a while, you develop skills of your own and a knack for what you're feeling and what you want the results to be. But this is the shaping stage. Let's make this sort of round. I just realized this one's pretty oval. And this one's pretty oval. You can either grease the pan or you can line it with parchment. You can use butter or oil, whatever, margarine, whatever it is that you prefer. I have pork lard. So there's my loaf. I'm going to set these aside for a minute. If you want to have soft-sided buns, you want the buns to touch each other as they rise. If you want crispy-sided buns, you leave them so that they don't touch. Then the sides can bake. I prefer to have them a little bit closer and have soft sides. Now we're going to leave these for a second rise. I'm going to put that same damp tea towel over top and just leave them for another 35-45 minutes until they rise. I'll be back shortly. Step 6 is the second rise. The bread's already been risen and kneaded and shaped, and now we're just going to let it rise. All right, look at how much that has risen. It's finished its second rise. Step 7 is going to be bake the bread. This is when it starts to smell good. And I'm going to put this in a preheated oven at 350 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes. Back shortly. Step 8 is the hollow sound. Knock, knock, knock. So we're going to pat on the bottom of the bread. We're just going to tap on it, and it should have a hollow sound. That will allow us to know that the bread is airy inside instead of wet inside. You want to take your loaf of bread out of your pan, turn it upside down, and listen for a hollow sound when you thud on it, when you tap on it. That hollow sound tells me that the bread is cooked thoroughly. There's no wet spots inside. Perfect. And look at that color. You can hear it on them too. And then pretty quickly afterwards is step 9. Do you want a soft crust that you can slice easily and enjoy as just a sandwich bread? Or do you want a more crunchy crust that is going to be more suitable for a tearing bread, or if you don't mind that hard crust on your bread? I like a soft crust, so I'm going to coat mine with a layer of butter. If you don't mind and you prefer a crispy crust, just leave them as they are. Nice and crispy. Oh, this is going to be delicious. Step number 10. We're going to slice into this bread. We're going to let it cool before we slice it. If you cut into it too soon, the inside texture of your bread, which they call the crumb, is going to mush together and it will appear doughy when the rest of the process was perfectly fine. You were just impatient at the very end. Taking it apart, slicing into it at the end, just give it 5 minutes and you'll still have a steamy loaf of bread, and butter will still melt on it beautifully. You just have to give it that couple of minutes to cool off. And that's that. 10 basic steps to baking a loaf of bread. So here we go. This is still probably a little too warm. You can see it's mashing a little bit there, but not so bad. And it's still warm enough that that bread, or that butter, is going to melt on the bread. Look at that. All melty and delicious and still toasty warm. Time to dig in. Danny, do you want a slice of bread?
Yes, ma'am.
So a quick recap. We have 10 basic steps to a loaf of bread. We have measure, bloom the yeast, mix and knead, first rise, shape. So now we're on our second rise, our bake. We're going to look for that hollow sound. We're going to decide on our crust type and butter it if we want. And then we're going to cool it before we cut it. Oh, the bonus! Now we get to slice into it. Bonus step number 11. Devour that bread. Alright guys, hit that thumbs up and the subscribe button, and stick around for more videos on our channel. Thanks. See you next time.